The living room smelled like vanilla frosting and balloons, an odd but pleasant combination. Wrapping paper was strewn across the floor, evidence of an afternoon well spent. Priscilla sat cross-legged in the center of it all, twirling a pink ribbon between her fingers while her stuffed unicorn, affectionately named Sparkle, lay beside her. Ivy leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her daughter with the kind of quiet admiration that made everything else in the world feel small. 5 years had passed in the blink of an eye. How had they gotten here so fast? The party had been perfect in its small, homemade way. A handful of Priscilla's preschool friends had gathered in the tiny apartment, giggling over cupcakes and playing a chaotic game of pin the horn on the unicorn. Ivy had baked the cake herself, box mix, of course, because who had time to bake from scratch? Priscilla had insisted on extra sprinkles, so naturally, half of the frosting was covered in tiny, rainbow-colored dots. It was messy and lopsided and absolutely beautiful. Ivy's best friend, Layla, had helped orchestrate the entire event, balancing a plate of cookies in one hand and a juice box in the other like some sort of birthday party warrior. When the last of the kids had been picked up, Layla had given Ivy a knowing look. "We survived," she had said, clinking her glass of soda against Ivy's. It was only later that the accident happened. One moment, Priscilla had been skipping through the hallway in her socks, a balloon still tied to her wrist, and the next, there was a sharp cry followed by the unmistakable thud of a little body meeting hardwood. Ivy's heart had leaped into her throat as she rushed forward, her hands trembling as she lifted Priscilla into her arms. A small but steady stream of blood trickled from a cut near her eyebrow. The sight of it made Ivy dizzy. At the hospital, Priscilla was surprisingly brave, clutching Sparkle as the nurse dabbed at the wound. Ivy winced harder than her daughter did. "She'll be just fine," the nurse reassured her, smiling as she prepared the stitches. "Tough kid." The nerves in Ivy's chest began to unwind. "Tougher than me," she admitted, brushing a few scions of damp hair from Priscilla's forehead. "Just a couple of stitches," the nurse added. "No need to worry." She turned to the chart, scanning the information, and then paused. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she glanced between Ivy and Priscilla, as if something wasn't quite computing. Ivy noticed but didn't think much of it. "Did you want to confirm her blood type for our records?" the nurse asked, her voice careful. Ivy frowned. "Her blood type? It should be A positive, same as mine." The nurse hesitated, then tapped something on the chart. "Actually, the preliminary check shows she's O negative." Ivy let out a small laugh. "That can't be right. Her father was B positive. She can't be O negative." The nurse didn't laugh with her. "Blood types don't change," she said gently. Ivy opened her mouth, then closed it again. The conversation had taken a turn she wasn't prepared for. "Must be a mistake," she said, waving it off, but something uneasy settled in her stomach. "I'm sure it is," the nurse agreed quickly, but there was a note in her voice that suggested she wasn't as convinced. By the time Priscilla's stitches were finished, the moment had passed, replaced by hugs and promises of ice cream. The hospital visit became just another minor parenting disaster, the kind that would be funny in hindsight. But the nurse's hesitation lingered in Ivy's mind, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. 2 days later, Ivy got a call from the hospital. She answered on autopilot, balancing a grocery bag on her hip while trying to shove her keys into the front door. "Miss Chandler?" Ivy frowned. No one ever called her that unless something was wrong. "Yes? This is Dr. Sharma from City General. I'm calling about Priscilla's routine lab work." Ivy's grip on the phone tightened. "Is everything okay?" A pause. Then a breath. Then the sentence that would change everything. "There's been an anomaly with the test results. We'd like you to come in for further discussion." Ivy's stomach dropped. "What kind of anomaly?" Another pause. "I think it's best if we discuss it in person." Ivy didn't wait. She drove to the hospital with Priscilla in the back seat, humming to herself like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The waiting room smelled sterile, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as Ivy tapped her foot against the linoleum floor. When they finally led her into the doctor's office, she barely sat before demanding answers. "What's going on?" Dr. Sharma adjusted his glasses and folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Chandler, I don't want to alarm you. But we ran additional tests on Priscilla's blood sample. The results are definitive." Ivy's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear him. "Definitive how?" Dr. Sharma exhaled slowly, as if he, too, wished he didn't have to say it. "Priscilla isn't biologically related to you." The words settled into the air, heavy and immovable. Ivy blinked. Then she let out a short laugh, one that didn't sound like her own. "I don't understand." "That's impossible." "I understand this must be a shock." "No," Ivy shook her head fiercely. "I was pregnant with her. I felt her kick. I gave birth to her. This isn't just some mix-up. She's my daughter." Dr. Sharma nodded. "I believe you. But the DNA test doesn't lie." Ivy felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her crumbling. She stared at him, willing him to take it back, to say there had been another mistake, that someone had mixed up the samples again. But he didn't. He just watched her with quiet sympathy. Her fingers dug into the armrests of the chair. "Then where is my real daughter?" No one had an answer. Ivy sat in the hospital's administrative office, her nails digging into the cheap plastic of the visitor's chair. The walls were a muted beige, the kind of color designed to be unmemorable, but today, everything felt too sharp, too bright, too clinical. Across the desk, a woman in a crisp blazer and a nameplate that read Rachel Monroe, patient relations coordinator, folded her hands and smiled with the kind of practiced patience that set Ivy's teeth on edge. "I understand this must be confusing," Rachel said, her voice smooth, her expression carefully neutral. "But lab errors happen more often than people realize. There are a number of reasons why the results might have been inaccurate: sample contamination, technician oversight." Ivy's grip tightened. "Then run it again." Rachel's smile didn't waver. "We certainly can, but I assure you, this is nothing to be alarmed about. Your daughter is happy and healthy, and that's what really matters, right?" Ivy felt her pulse hammer in her ears. "What matters," she said, keeping her voice steady, "is knowing the truth. You don't get to pat me on the head and send me home like some paranoid mother who read too many conspiracy blogs. Do the test again." Rachel opened her mouth, but something in Ivy's face must have stopped her. She sighed, clicked a few keys on her computer, and nodded. "We'll process a new request." Ivy exhaled, her hands still trembling as she pushed herself up from the chair. "Good. Call me when you have the results." She walked out without waiting for a reply. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Priscilla as a newborn, bundled in the soft pink blanket the hospital had given her. She remembered the weight of her tiny body against her chest, the way her fingers had curled instinctively around Ivy's. It had been real. It had been hers. Hadn't it? 2 days later, the hospital called back. The new test results were identical to the first. The next morning, Ivy sat in the waiting room of a private DNA testing clinic, gripping a clipboard so tightly her knuckles ached. A receptionist in pastel scrubs gave her a sympathetic smile as she handed over the necessary forms. This place smelled less sterile than the hospital, but it still had that faint antiseptic scent that made Ivy's stomach churn. She had to be sure. She had told Layla everything, and in true Layla fashion, she had shown up at Ivy's apartment with coffee, a notebook, and a plan. Best case scenario, the hospital's just incompetent, Layla had said, flipping open her notebook. Worst case scenario, something actually happened, and we need a lawyer." Ivy had snorted. "Worst case scenario, Priscilla isn't mine, and someone else has my real daughter." Layla had gone quiet at that. Now, sitting in the clinic, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything would shift. If the hospital's test was wrong, she could breathe again. If it wasn't. A nurse called Priscilla's name, and Ivy took her hand, walking her back toward the exam room. Priscilla, oblivious, swung their linked hands back and forth. "Mommy, do I get a sticker?" Ivy forced a smile. "Of course, baby." The test itself was simple. A quick swab inside Priscilla's cheek, Ivy's own sample taken the same way, and then a promise that results would be ready in 3 days. The wait stretched endlessly, every hour thick with the weight of uncertainty. When the call finally came, Ivy sat on her couch, her hands clutching the phone so tightly she was afraid she might crack the plastic. "The results confirm the previous tests," the technician said, his voice gentle, as if preparing for an emotional collapse on her end. "There is 0 probability of maternity." "I'm so sorry." Ivy barely mumbled a response before hanging up. Priscilla wasn't hers. She didn't remember setting the phone down. She didn't remember moving to the bedroom, curling onto her side, pulling her knees up toward her chest like she could make herself small enough to make this disappear. She must have fallen asleep because she woke to the sound of Priscilla's giggles in the next room, Layla's voice lilting in amusement. Ivy forced herself up, moving toward the doorway, watching as Layla sat on the floor with Priscilla, stacking colorful blocks into an impressive tower. Layla glanced up, her expression shifting the moment she saw Ivy. She reached out, squeezing Ivy's hand. "We're gonna figure this out," she murmured. Ivy nodded, but inside, her mind was unraveling. She needed more than a DNA test. She needed answers. The next morning, she drove back to the hospital, requesting copies of her medical records. The receptionist, a young man with round glasses and a nervous smile, hesitated. Usually, these requests take a few days to process. Ivy didn't blink. "I'll wait." She had come prepared, clutching a printout of patient rights, highlighting every section that legally required them to comply. The receptionist left and returned 10 minutes later, handing her a sealed envelope. Ivy sat in her car, heart hammering, as she ripped it open. Pages of text, lines of numbers, notes in neat, printed letters. She skimmed through, her eyes scanning until labor end time, 3:27 a.m. Birth recorded, 4:15 a.m. Ivy frowned, flipping through the pages, searching for an explanation. Nearly an hour unaccounted for. She had labored for over 16 hours, she remembered the exhaustion, the relief when she heard Priscilla cry, but she didn't remember a delay. She tried to reason it away. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe she had passed out, something no one thought to mention. Maybe paperwork got misplaced. But nothing about this felt like a simple mistake. She gripped the papers so tightly they crumpled in her hands. Priscilla wasn't hers. And if that was true, then someone else had given birth at the same time. Ivy's stomach twisted. If Priscilla wasn't hers, then where was her real daughter? Dr. Julian West had the kind of voice that could make anything sound like a minor inconvenience. A billing error, a scheduling mix-up, a child being handed to the wrong mother in a hospital, apparently, to him, all just clerical issues. Ivy sat across from him in his immaculate office, watching as he adjusted his tie in the reflection of his computer screen. He barely looked at her, which was impressive considering she was practically vibrating with rage. "There's no cause for concern," he said smoothly, clicking through files on his desktop. "These things happen more often than you think. It's almost always an error in record keeping. Data entry mistakes. Typos." He said, typos, like Priscilla's entire existence, could be reduced to a misclicked button. Ivy clenched her fists under the desk. My child isn't a typo. Drive West sighed, finally, looking at her. His expression was calm, patronizingly so. Miss Chandler, I understand how upsetting this must be, but what I'm telling you is that there is no evidence that anything happened that night outside of the ordinary. Your daughter is your daughter. The birth certificate, the hospital records, everything is clear. Except for the DNA test, she snapped. A test that could have been mislabeled, he countered without missing a beat. Twice? He folded his hands, exhaling through his nose. Miss Chandler, what is it that you want? I want to know what happened the night my daughter was born. Drive West leaned back, his chair creaking. The same thing that happens every night. A series of exhausted women gave birth, a rotation of nurses did their jobs, and a handful of newborns were brought into the world. You're asking me to dig into something that happened years ago, when there is no proof that anything is actually wrong. Ivy's nails dug into her palms. There's proof. He held up a hand. A blood test isn't proof of a crime. It's a medical anomaly. Anomaly. That was the word he was going with. Not mistake, not negligence, just a casual, quirky little anomaly, like a car engine making a funny noise or a vending machine refusing to take a dollar bill. Ivy's body felt electric with frustration. She wanted to stand up, flip his desk, scream in his face. Instead, she forced herself to take a deep breath. Then you won't mind if I request access to all medical records from that night. Drive West's easy demeanor tightened just slightly. That's not possible. Why not? Because those records contain private information about other patients. I only need mine. He smiled like she had misunderstood something very simple. Miss Chandler, birth logs include multiple patients. We can't just go handing them out. Then let me see my own file. I assure you, everything in your file is accurate. Ivy's jaw tensed. He was stonewalling her. And he was doing it so confidently, so dismissively, that it made her feel like maybe she was the one being unreasonable. Drive West checked his watch, a deliberate movement. I understand this is difficult, but you need to think about what's best for your child. Is digging into this really going to help her? Or will it just cause unnecessary confusion? Ivy stood abruptly. You know what would be best for my child? Knowing if she's actually mine. Drive West exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Miss Chandler. Thank you for your time, she cut in before he could finish whatever useless sentence he was about to deliver. She grabbed her bag, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the office. She didn't even make it to the car before she started crying. The drive home was a blur of honking horns and streetlights that all looked too bright. She pulled into her parking spot, wiped her face, and sat gripping the steering wheel until the anger dulled into something quieter, something more dangerous. Drive West thought she would drop it. He thought he could dismiss her like she was just another overdramatic mother who had Googled too much and convinced herself of something ridiculous. She was not dropping this. Ivy wasn't an idiot. She had worked in an office long enough to know that when someone was that eager to shut down questions, it meant there was something to hide. And if Drive West wasn't going to help her, she was going to find someone who would. She took a deep breath and grabbed her phone. The hospital had been so sure she wouldn't push. But there was one person they hadn't accounted for. Ivy scrolled through the list of employees, skimming names until one jumped out at her. Layla Nguyen. A nurse. One who had been working at the hospital for over a decade. Ivy tapped on her profile, found her contact information, and took another deep breath before pressing call. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, cautious and a little tired. Hello? Layla? A pause. Who's this? Ivy's throat tightened. You don't know me. But I think you might have been working the night my daughter was born. The silence on the other end was deafening. Ivy closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temple. Please. I just need to ask you some questions. A long exhale. Then, quietly, I can't talk about this over the phone. Ivy's pulse quickened. Then can we meet? Layla hesitated. I don't know. Please, Ivy whispered, voice barely holding together. Something happened that night. I just need to know the truth. Another beat of silence. Then, finally, a reluctant sigh. Tomorrow. After my shift. There's a coffee shop on 8th and Vernon. Don't be late. The line went dead. Ivy let the phone drop into her lap. Her hands were shaking. This was it. Someone knew something. And she was about to find out what. The coffee shop was half empty, the kind of place where the pastries looked better than they tasted and the espresso machine wheezed like an asthmatic. Ivy sat at a small table by the window, gripping her cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her, Layla and Gwyn stirred her tea, though she hadn't taken a sip. She looked exhausted. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her dark hair pulled into a bun that had started to come undone. Every few seconds, she glanced over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to swoop in and drag her away. I shouldn't be talking to you, Layla muttered. Ivy leaned in. I just want the truth. Layla let out a slow breath, setting her spoon down. You don't understand how dangerous this is. Ivy's stomach twisted. Dangerous? Not in the way you're thinking. Layla rubbed her forehead. I mean for you. If you go down this path, if you open this door, you won't be able to close it. I don't care, Ivy said. Priscilla isn't my daughter. And if she isn't mine, I need to know who she is. Layla was silent for a long time, staring at the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There was a power outage that night. Ivy blinked. Layla let out a short, humorless laugh. You have no idea how chaotic a blackout is in a hospital. Even with backup generators, there's a window of time where everything is. She shook her head. Just a mess. And it happened while you were in labor. Ivy's pulse pounded in her ears. What are you saying? Layla took another deep breath, like she was about to confess something she had been carrying for years. There were 2 emergency births that night, she said. Yours and another woman's. Ivy felt the world tilt. Elena Foster. The name meant nothing to her. A.S.N. Geinger. Someone who had given birth just as she had, while the hospital lights flickered, while nurses and doctors scrambled in the dim glow of emergency lamps. Layla's fingers tightened around her cup. After the power came back on, there was confusion in the NICU. Ivy's hands went numb. I wasn't working that unit, but I heard whispers. There were 2 babies. And after the blackout, there was uncertainty about which baby belonged to which mother. Ivy's breath hitched. Staff swore everything was sorted out, Layla continued. Paperwork was adjusted. But mistakes happen, especially when people are panicking. She swallowed hard. I think your babies were switched. Ivy barely registered the clatter of her coffee cup as she set it down too hard. Her entire body felt like it had been plunged into ice water. My baby, she whispered. My real baby. She pressed a hand against her forehead, nausea creeping in. Everything she knew, everything she had built her life around, was unraveling in front of her. Layla's expression was pained. I thought about speaking up back then, but I had no proof. And no one wanted to hear it. Do you know what it's like to accuse a hospital of something like that? Ivy barely heard her. She was already reaching for her phone, her mind moving at 100 miles an hour. Elena Foster. She had a name. She needed a face. She opened social media, fingers trembling as she typed. There were a few profiles. A couple of private accounts. Then her breath caught. The woman in the profile picture was holding a little girl. Ivy clicked on the image, her heart slamming against her ribs. The child was about 5 years old, with a toothy grin and curls that looked impossible to tame. And she had Ivy's eyes. Not just similar. Not just vaguely familiar. The exact same shape, the exact same shade of green Ivy had stared at in the mirror her entire life. Ivy zoomed in, scanning the girl's face like she was trying to memorize every detail. Then she saw it. A tiny birth Noel on the girl's left shoulder. The same birth Noel Ivy had. The same one her mother had. Her stomach turned over. Mara. That was her name. Ivy's vision blurred. Mara was her real daughter. She swallowed back the rising nausea, blinking rapidly. Her real daughter was out there. And she had no idea. Ivy dropped the phone onto the table, pushing back from her chair as panic clawed its way up her throat. Layla reached for her wrist. Hey. Breathe. Ivy's chest felt too tight. I have to. Layla squeezed gently. I know. But you have to think before you act. You can't just show up at her door and tell her she's been raising the wrong child. Ivy's heart thundered in her chest. Then what am I supposed to do? Layla hesitated. You have to be smart about this. Ivy pressed her palms against her face, trying to think through the static in her head. She couldn't just sit with this information. She couldn't go home and pretend everything was fine. She had to talk to Elena. She had to find a way to tell her. But how did you tell a mother that the daughter she had loved and raised wasn't hers? Ivy never thought she'd be the kind of person to orchestrate a fake social event just to meet a Geinger, but here she was, standing in the middle of a neighborhood park with a clipboard and a stack of flyers, pretending she was organizing a community picnic. She had spent an embarrassing amount of time debating what kind of event would feel natural enough that she could invite a complete Geinger without raising suspicion. A park gathering seemed safe. Casual. Non-threatening. She had found Elena's address with some careful internet sleuthing, cross-referencing an old work profile with a local business listing. It had taken 3 cups of coffee and the kind of obsessive determination usually reserved for last-minute science fair projects. Once she had the address, she had done something she still wasn't sure she could justify. She had driven past the house. Just once. Just to see. It was small but well kept, a little white bungalow with blue shutters and a swing set in the yard. There had been a flower box under the window, slightly overgrown, and 2 pink scooters abandoned near the driveway. Ivy had gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers ached. Somewhere inside that house was her daughter. The daughter she hadn't held since birth. Now, standing near the park's picnic tables, she scanned the crowd, heart pounding as if she were waiting for an exam she hadn't studied for. Parents milled around, chatting while their kids chased bubbles and threw frisbees. Ivy had extended the invite to most of the families in the area, hoping to make it feel natural. She didn't want Elena to feel targeted, even though this entire event existed for one reason and one reason only. Then, there she was. Elena Foster. Ivy felt like she had stepped into some surreal version of her own life, where things were slightly off-kilter but no one else noticed. Elena looked about the same age as her, maybe a little younger, with wavy brown hair pulled into a ponytail and a sundress that had probably seen better days. She carried herself like someone who was constantly balancing too many things at once, adjusting a tote bag over her shoulder while reaching down to pick up a stuffed animal that had been dropped on the sidewalk. And beside her, gripping the hem of her dress, was Mara. Ivy's lungs forgot how to function. It was like looking into a childhood mirror. The same green eyes, wide and bright. The same dark curls that refused to be tamed. The same little birth Noel on her left shoulder, peeking out from under her ruffled sleeve. Ivy felt dizzy. This was her child. Her real, actual child, standing 5 feet away from her, completely unaware. Ivy swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus as Elena glanced around, looking slightly unsure. "Hi," Ivy said, stepping forward with what she hoped was a casual smile. "I'm Ivy. I think we messaged about the picnic." Elena shifted Mara onto her hip and nodded. "Oh, right. Sorry we're late. It took me longer than I expected to get out the door." She looked down at Mara and gave her a quick squeeze. Somebody couldn't decide which dress to wear. Ivy tried to laugh, but it came out wrong, like she had forgotten how sound was supposed to work. She nodded instead. Mara squirmed in her mother's arms, reaching toward the ground. Elena set her down, and she immediately took off toward the playground. Ivy's eyes followed her, unable to look away. "She's adorable," Ivy said, her voice uneven. Elena smiled. "She's a handful." Ivy forced herself to stop staring. She gestured toward the snack table. "There's lemonade, if you want some. And I think someone brought cookies." Elena nodded, shifting her bag on her shoulder. "Thanks." Ivy watched as she walked away, then exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest. She needed to get herself together. She had spent so much time wondering what it would be like to see Mara, and now that she was here, Ivy felt completely unprepared. Her heart was a tangled mess of emotions she hadn't fully processed. She loved Priscilla more than anything. That was undeniable. Priscilla was her daughter in every way that mattered. But Mara was her blood. Her genes. Her history. She had missed everything. Her first steps. Her first words. The way she crinkled her nose when she laughed. Ivy felt a sharp pang of guilt, because no matter how much she told herself that she had done nothing wrong, that she had been a victim in all of this, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed. She had been raising someone else's child while another woman had been raising hers. She looked back toward the playground, where Mara was climbing onto a swing. Ivy had no idea how she was supposed to do this. She couldn't just walk up to Elena and drop this bomb on her in the middle of a picnic. There was no script for this kind of thing. No way to gently tell a mother that the child she had loved and nurtured for 5 years wasn't hers. Ivy clenched her hands into fists, willing herself to stay calm. She needed to do this the right way. If such a thing even existed. Elena laughed as she watched Mara sprint across the playground, her curls bouncing with each step. "She's going to wear herself out before we even get home," she said, shaking her head. "Not that I'm complaining. I could use an easy bedtime tonight." Ivy smiled, though her mind was still racing. Being near Mara was surreal in a way she hadn't expected. Every small movement, every expression, it all felt achingly familiar, like watching an old home video of herself as a child. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a water bottle. She twisted off the cap, took a sip, and sighed. "It's so nice to be out of the house," she said. "Honestly, I've been feeling off lately. Just run down, I guess." Ivy's stomach tensed. "Run down how?" Elena waved a dismissive hand. "You know, the usual mom stuff. Tired all the time, dizzy sometimes. I probably just need more sleep." Ivy frowned. "That doesn't sound like just being tired." "It's nothing," Elena said. "I don't have time to be sick." Ivy crossed her arms. "That's not how it works." Elena sighed and took another sip of water. "I'm fine. Have you seen a doctor?" Elena gave her a look. "Ivy." Ivy tilted her head. "What? You think I have time to sit around in waiting rooms for someone to tell me I need to eat more leafy greens?" Ivy let out a breath. I think it could be something more serious. Elena's face softened. I appreciate the concern, I do. But I can't afford to take off work for a bunch of expensive tests. It's not that simple. Ivy wanted to argue. She wanted to insist, to grab her by the shoulders and shake some sense into her, but before she could say anything else, Mara came running over, her face flushed from the sun. "Mommy, I'm thirsty," she announced. Elena handed her the bottle. "Drink slow, sweetheart. You always chug it too fast." Ivy watched them, her chest tightening. Mara had no idea that anything was wrong. No idea that her mother was brushing off something that might be serious. Ivy swallowed her unease and forced herself to smile. "She's got a lot of energy." Elena snorted. "You have no idea." Ivy wanted to push the subject, but she could tell it wasn't going anywhere. Elena had made up her mind. And there was only so much she could do without crossing a line. She had to let it go. For now. Later that evening, Ivy couldn't stop thinking about it. She told herself she was overreacting, that people felt run down all the time and it wasn't a sign of something catastrophic. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, something she couldn't quite shake. She was still thinking about it the next day, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had already reheated twice. And then her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated before answering. "Ivy?" She sat up straighter. "Elena?" There was a pause. Then another voice came on the line. A man's voice. "Hi, ma'am. This is James from Briarwood Urgent Care. I'm calling because we have a patient here, Elena Foster. She collapsed earlier today, and you were listed as her emergency contact." Ivy's blood ran cold. What? "She was brought in about an hour ago," the man continued. "She's stable, but the doctors are running some tests." Ivy was already grabbing her keys. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. Ivy sat in one of the plastic chairs, her knee bouncing. She had barely spoken to the receptionist before rushing through the doors, demanding to see Elena. Now she was stuck waiting. The minutes dragged. Finally, a nurse appeared. "Ivy Chandler?" She shot to her feet. "Yes. She's awake. You can see her now." Ivy followed the nurse down the hall, her heart pounding. Elena was sitting up in bed, looking paler than Ivy had ever seen her. She gave a tired smile. "I bet you're going to say, 'I told you so.'" Ivy let out a shaky breath. "What happened?" Elena sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I was at work, and I guess I got dizzy. Next thing I know, I'm on the floor, and someone's calling an ambulance." Ivy's chest ached. "Elena." "I'm fine," Elena said quickly. "They're running tests, but..." "You are not fine," Ivy snapped. Elena held up a hand. "Okay." Poor choice of words. Ivy sat down in the chair next to the bed, pressing her palms against her eyes. "I knew something was wrong." Elena exhaled. "They think it's something with my blood pressure. Maybe anemia. I don't know yet." Ivy's fingers curled around the armrest. If something happened to Elena, who would take care of Mara? Ivy lifted her head, studying Elena's face. She was going to say it. She had to. "Elena." Elena glanced at her, eyebrows raised. Ivy's throat felt tight. "There's something I have to tell you." Elena's expression shifted. "What is it?" Ivy took a breath. Her voice faltered. Elena frowned. "Ivy, you're freaking me out." Ivy clenched her hands together. "I found something out recently." Something big. Elena waited. Ivy's stomach turned. How do you tell someone that their daughter isn't really theirs? She exhaled slowly. Elena, the night we gave birth, there was a mistake. Elena's face froze. Ivy swallowed. We had our babies the same night. During the blackout. Elena blinked. What are you talking about? Ivy forced herself to meet her eyes. I think they switched our daughters. The silence was suffocating. Elena let out a short laugh, but it was humorless. Ivy, that's crazy. Ivy pulled out her phone, scrolling until she found the picture. The one of Mara. She held it up. Elena stared. Ivy's voice was barely a whisper. That's my daughter. Elena didn't move. Ivy placed the phone on the bed. Elena's hand trembled as she picked it up. She stared at it. Then at Ivy. Then back at the photo. Ivy swallowed the lump in her throat. Priscilla is yours. And Mara is mine. Elena didn't speak. Ivy held her breath. Then, finally. Elena whispered, "Oh my God." Elena's fingers trembled as she gripped the phone, her eyes locked on the picture. She wasn't blinking. She wasn't speaking. She was just staring, her face frozen in an expression Ivy couldn't quite decipher. It was like watching someone unravel in slow motion. Ivy held her breath, waiting for it to sink in. Elena finally let out a soft, uneven breath. No, she whispered. Ivy's chest tightened. Elena shook her head, more forcefully this time. No, no, no. This is insane. Ivy didn't argue. She had gone through this exact process herself, the disbelief, the gut-wrenching refusal to accept it, the way every piece of logic in her brain had screamed that it was impossible. But the facts didn't care what she wanted to believe. Elena was breathing faster now, her knuckles white around the phone. You're wrong. There's no way. Ivy pressed her lips together. I'm not wrong. Elena looked up at her, and for a second, Ivy thought she was going to throw the phone across the hospital room. But instead, her shoulders sagged, and her whole body seemed to deflate. She exhaled shakily. Oh my God. Ivy felt something splinter inside her. Elena swallowed hard, dragging her gaze back to the picture, her fingers hesitantly tracing the screen. She has your eyes. Ivy barely nodded. She had spent so long staring at that photo, memorizing every small detail, searching for proof of something her heart already knew. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. This explains everything. Ivy forced herself to speak. What do you mean? Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. I love her. You have to know that. Ivy nodded, because of course she did. But there were moments, Elena's voice cracked. Tiny, fleeting moments where something felt off. Where I'd see her do something and think, that doesn't come from me. And I hated myself for it. Her hands trembled. I told myself I was being crazy. I convinced myself that biology didn't matter, that sometimes kids just take after distant relatives. But deep down, her breath hitched. I always felt it. Ivy's chest tightened. Elena looked up at her, eyes glassy. I've been raising your daughter. Ivy let out a slow, shaky breath. And I've been raising yours. Elena blinked rapidly, like she was trying to force the tears back. She failed. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face with her hands. Ivy didn't hesitate. She reached for her, pulling her into a tight embrace, and that was all it took. Elena sobbed into her shoulder, gripping Ivy like she was the only thing keeping her from collapsing completely. Ivy felt herself shaking too, the weight of everything crashing down at once. They clung to each other, two mothers mourning the lives they had missed, the moments that had been stolen from them, the babies they had never had the chance to hold beyond that first night in the hospital. When Elena finally pulled away, she wiped at her damp cheeks. "What do we do?" Ivy sniffed, willing herself to stay steady. "We don't separate them." Elena's expression softened. "They're sisters," Ivy whispered. "They've grown up together. We can't take that away from them." Elena nodded slowly. "You're right." Ivy exhaled. "We find a way to make this work." Elena gave a watery laugh. "This wasn't exactly in my parenting handbook." Ivy let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor behind it. "Same." Elena's eyes darkened. "But the hospital." Ivy's jaw tightened. "They did this." Elena's hands curled into fists. "They let this happen." Ivy grabbed her phone. "We make them pay for it." Elena's voice was firm. "Then let's do it." Ivy scrolled through her contacts, her pulse steady now. "I know someone. A lawyer. She's good." Elena straightened, her expression resolute. "Let's get justice." Ivy had never been inside a law office before, and if she were being honest, she had always imagined them to be a little more dramatic. Movies made it seem like lawyers worked in towering buildings made of nothing but glass and ambition, where they spent their days shouting, "Objection," and making game-changing speeches at the 11th hour. In reality, Sophie Barrett's office was smaller than Ivy's living room, smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and had a cluttered desk that suggested its owner had about 5 minutes of free time per week. Sophie, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, barely looked up as she flipped through the folder in front of her. "You two are about to make a lot of people very uncomfortable," she said, scanning the documents with an almost lazy confidence. "That's my favorite kind of case." Elena, who had been quiet since they arrived, crossed her arms. "The hospital already denied everything. What if they keep stalling?" Sophie smirked. "They won't." Ivy leaned forward. "How do you know?" Sophie turned a page, eyes skimming quickly. "Because they were sloppy." She slid a paper across the desk. "We found an incident report from the night of the blackout." Ivy grabbed it, her pulse spiking. Elena shifted beside her, leaning in to read. The words were cold. Clinical. A nurse, identified only by an employee number, had filed a concern about confusion in the NICU during the power outage. The notes mentioned that 2 newborns had temporarily been placed in the wrong bassinets but were properly reassigned following verification. Elena's breath hitched. Properly reassigned? Ivy's hands clenched around the edges of the paper. "They knew." Sophie nodded. "And they buried it." Elena exhaled sharply. "So what do we do now?" Sophie sat back in her chair, tapping a pen against the desk. "Now? We let them know we have it." The hospital's lawyers didn't take long to respond after that. Less than 24 hours later, Sophie's office received a call requesting an urgent meeting. Ivy and Elena sat across from her desk, their stomachs in knots as she listened, nodding occasionally before hanging up with a smirk. "Well," Sophie said, setting her phone down. "They're scared." Elena scoffed. "Good." Ivy's hands felt clammy. "What did they say?" Sophie folded her arms. "They want to settle." Silence stretched between them. Elena blinked. "Just like that?" "They don't want this in court." Sophie leaned forward. "They know what happens if this goes public. A jury would tear them apart." Ivy let out a slow breath. The hospital had spent weeks ignoring them, dismissing them, treating them like a nuisance. And now, with one document, the tide had shifted. Elena sat up straighter. "So what's the offer?" Sophie's lips curled. Let's find out. Ivy had always imagined that winning something, anything, would feel triumphant. That there would be some kind of moment where the sky opened up, where the universe gave her a nod of approval, where she could throw her arms up in victory and scream, "I did it." But sitting across from the hospital's attorneys in an overly air-conditioned conference room, she mostly just felt exhausted. Elena sat beside her, stiff-backed, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might snap in half. Across the table, 3 lawyers in expensive suits shuffled papers, speaking in hushed tones to one another like they could still negotiate their way out of this. Drive West was there, too, perched at the head of the table like a man who had barely survived a car crash and was still trying to convince himself he wasn't injured. Ivy hadn't spoken to him since their last meeting, but now, with Sophie Barrett leading the charge, she didn't have to. Sophie tapped a pen against her folder. "Let's be clear about something," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through glass. "A simple financial settlement is not going to cut it." One of the lawyers, a man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of polished demeanor that suggested he had been paid to make problems disappear for a very long time, cleared his throat. "We are prepared to offer a substantial sum." Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course you are." Ivy leaned forward. "Do you think you can just write a check and make this go away?" Another lawyer, a younger woman who looked deeply uncomfortable, shifted in her chair. "We recognize the gravity of the situation, Ms. Chandler." "But..." "No," Sophie interrupted. "You don't." She slid the incident report across the table. "Or else you wouldn't have buried this." Drive West cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "There was no..." "Don't," Elena cut in. "Just don't." Ivy could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent weeks clawing her way toward this moment, had replayed every version of this conversation in her head. She had imagined them groveling. She had imagined them indifferent. She had imagined them angry. She had not imagined the quiet, suffocating panic that now filled the room. Sophie folded her hands. "We're not here to negotiate a number. We're here to demand security for our clients and their daughters." The younger lawyer adjusted her glasses. "What kind of security?" Ivy took a breath. "Elena's medical care. Full coverage. No loopholes. No cutting her off after a year." Elena lifted her chin. "And trust funds for both girls. Enough to make up for what was stolen from them." The older lawyer exchanged glances with his colleagues. "That's a significant request." Sophie's smile was razor sharp. "So was stealing their children." Silence. The younger lawyer jotted something down. "And what else?" Ivy exhaled. "A public acknowledgement." Drive West straightened. "Absolutely not." Sophie arched a brow. "Then we go to trial." Ivy didn't miss the way his fingers twitched. The way his shoulders tensed. He knew. He knew they'd win. The room was so quiet Ivy could hear the faint hum of the air vents. Finally, the older lawyer sighed, adjusting his tie like it was suddenly too tight. "We'll need time to draft the terms." Sophie leaned back. "Take your time." Ivy's hand found Elena's beneath the table, squeezing once. They had one. Elena had never been good at slowing down. Slowing down meant acknowledging things, exhaustion, stress, the fact that she had been running on fumes for years. Slowing down meant letting someone else take over, and that wasn't something she had ever been comfortable with. But lying in a hospital bed with Ivy sitting beside her, flipping absent-mindedly through a magazine, Elena realized she didn't have a choice. "Did you know this guy has been voted sexiest man alive twice?" Ivy mused, holding up a glossy page with a chiseled actor staring smugly into the camera. "Twice. That's excessive." Elena shot her a weak glare. Are you seriously talking to me about celebrity gossip right now? Ivy shrugged, tossing the magazine onto the bedside table. I could talk to you about your cholesterol instead, but I figured this was safer. Elena groaned, sinking further into the pillow. God, I miss when you were just some woman from a coffee shop. Ivy smirked. Yeah, well. That ship has sailed. The nurse entered then, checking Elena's for and making notes on the chart at the foot of the bed. Ivy watched her like she was memorizing every detail, sitting up a little straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Elena resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Ivy had appointed herself as her personal watchdog, which was both irritating and, if she was being honest, kind of nice. Everything looks good, the nurse said, adjusting the monitor. Try to get some rest. When the door closed behind her, Elena sighed. Rest. Right. I'll get right on that. Ivy arched a brow. You should. You have a team of doctors looking after you now. Might as well let them do their jobs. Elena frowned. Still weird to think about. Ivy's expression softened. You mean letting someone take care of you? Elena scoffed. I don't know how to do that. Ivy leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You don't have to know how. You just let me do it. Elena looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly. Why are you like this? Ivy grinned. Annoying? Relentless. Ivy smirked. I don't know. Maybe because someone had to be. Elena didn't respond to that. The last few weeks had been a blur of doctors' visits, legal meetings, and long, exhausting conversations about what came next. The hospital had agreed to cover every medical expense as part of the settlement, and Sophie had made sure there were no loopholes, no buried clauses that could come back to bite them later. Elena didn't have to fight anymore. She just had to get better. Ivy had been at every appointment, showing up with coffee, asking the doctors the questions Elena didn't even think to ask. She was there when the medications made her nauseous, when the test results came back with numbers neither of them could fully understand. She sat through waiting rooms and paperwork and insurance calls, and she never once made Elena feel like she had to apologize for any of it. Elena wasn't used to that. But she was starting to think she could be. Outside the hospital, life continued in a way that felt surreal. Mara and Priscilla had adjusted in their own way, slipping into their new reality without the weight that their mothers carried. They didn't see their story as a tragedy or a lawsuit or a hospital scandal. They saw it as something much simpler. They were sisters. Ivy and Elena had made a decision early on not to frame it as losing one daughter and gaining another. There was no talk of switching back, no conversation about what was supposed to happen. It was never about undoing the past. It was about moving forward. Priscilla still called Ivy Mommy, and Mara still called Elena Mommy, and that wasn't going to change. But now, Priscilla had an extra bedtime story from Elena, and Mara had another set of arms to wrap around her when she woke up from a bad dream. It wasn't perfect. There were difficult moments, confusing questions, things that neither Ivy nor Elena had answers for. But it was working. And somehow, without either of them fully acknowledging it, Ivy and Elena had fallen into an arrangement that neither of them had planned. They had become a team. Ivy had given Elena a key to her apartment. Elena had done the same. Weekends were flexible. Dinners were joint affairs more often than not. There was no formal custody agreement, no set schedule, no lines drawn in the sand. It didn't matter whose house they were sleeping in, both bedrooms had stuffed animals and favorite blankets, clothes in both closets, toothbrushes in both bathrooms. The girls had two homes, two mothers, and no expectations beyond the fact that they were loved. Ivy had gone from a single mother to a mother with a partner, not in the traditional sense, not in the way people expected. But in every way that mattered, she wasn't doing this alone anymore. Elena felt the same way. She was still adjusting, still trying to shake the feeling that if she let herself lean too much on Ivy, it would all collapse. But it hadn't. And the longer she let herself believe it was real, the easier it got. One evening, weeks after Elena had been discharged, she stood at Ivy's kitchen counter, slicing fruit while the girls played in the living room. The sound of laughter filled the space, the kind that made everything feel lighter. Ivy walked in, glancing at the scene before her. "I don't think they ever stop talking." Elena smirked. "Pretty sure they talk in their sleep." Ivy reached for a glass, filling it with water. "How are you feeling?" Elena considered lying. Saying she was fine, brushing it off like she always did. But instead, she set down the knife and leaned against the counter. "Tired," she admitted. "But better." Ivy nodded, taking a sip of water. "Good." Elena glanced toward the living room, where Mara and Priscilla were deep in conversation about something neither of them fully understood but both felt passionately about. Elena exhaled. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" Ivy turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Yeah," she said. "We are." Ivy never imagined she'd know so much about grief. Not the loud, dramatic kind people talked about in movies, the kind with screaming and falling to the ground, with casseroles from well-meaning neighbors and people constantly asking if you were okay. No, this was different. This was quiet. This was waking up in the morning and rolling over to grab her phone, only to realize there were no more updates from Elena. This was hearing a joke and making a mental note to tell her, only to remember she couldn't. Elena had always made dying seem like something that would happen someday, not soon, not now, not in a way that required planning. She had fought her illness with the kind of stubbornness that made Ivy want to engangle her on more than one occasion. Even in the final weeks, Elena had brushed off concern, cracking jokes in hospital beds, rolling her eyes when Ivy hovered too much. But Ivy had known. And so had Elena. That last night had been calm. Peaceful, in a way Ivy wasn't sure she had expected. She had sat beside Elena's bed, their hands resting near each other, neither of them saying much. They had talked about the girls, about how Mara had learned to tie her shoes, about how Priscilla was insisting on becoming a professional astronaut-ballerina hybrid. "She's going to be impossible when she's a teenager," Elena had murmured, eyes heavy-lidded but still filled with warmth. Ivy had smiled. "I'm counting on it." Elena had been quiet for a long time after that. Then, barely above a whisper, she had said, "Take care of her." It hadn't been a question. Ivy had squeezed her hand. "Always." And then, Elena had closed her eyes. She was gone by morning. The days that followed were a blur. Ivy handled the arrangements, signed the papers, made the calls. She had never planned a funeral before. She wasn't sure how it was supposed to feel. But in the end, it had been simple, just a handful of close friends, a scattering of flowers, no grand speeches. Just love, and grief, and the feeling of something slipping through her fingers before she was ready. She didn't cry in front of the girls. Not because she thought she had to be strong, but because grief was too big to explain to children who still thought everything in the world made sense. Mara didn't cry either. Not in the way Ivy expected. Instead, she became quieter. Less open. She curled into herself in a way that made Ivy's heart ache. She clung to routines like they were the only thing keeping her afloat. Pajamas had to be folded just the way her mother used to do it. Bedtime stories had to be read in the exact same order. Ivy let her. Priscilla, in contrast, filled the house with noise. She followed Mara everywhere, reaching for her hand at the dinner table, offering her favorite toys without a word. She talked constantly, about school, about the weather, about nonsense things that didn't matter. Ivy recognized it for what it was. Priscilla was trying to make the silence go away. One night, Ivy found Mara curled up on the couch, hugging one of Elena's sweaters. Ivy sat beside her, hesitant, unsure if Mara wanted space or closeness. After a long silence, Mara whispered, "I don't want her to be gone." Ivy swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I know." Mara's small hands clenched the fabric tighter. "Will I forget her?" Ivy felt her heart break, just a little. "No," she said softly. "You'll always remember her. And I'll help you." Mara finally turned her head, looking up at Ivy with big, uncertain eyes. "Do you miss her?" Ivy exhaled. "Every day." Mara pressed her face into the sweater. Then, so quietly Ivy almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Me too." The adoption process had already been in motion before Elena's passing. She had made sure everything was in place, that Ivy wouldn't have to fight for Mara. When the final paperwork came through, Ivy had taken Mara to the courthouse herself. The judge had asked her a few questions, whether she understood what this meant, whether she was ready for the responsibility. Ivy's voice had been steady. "Yes." And just like that, Mara was hers. Not because she hadn't been before, but because now, no one could take her away. At first, the adjustment had been slow. There were good days, bad days, and days that stretched endlessly in between. Some nights, Mara woke up crying and refused to say why. Some mornings, Priscilla tried too hard to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Ivy let them take their time. And slowly, things shifted. The house became a home again, laughter creeping back into corners where grief had settled. Mara and Priscilla fell into an easy rhythm, their bonds solidified not by shared DNA but by something stronger, by whispered secrets at bedtime, by trading half-eaten cookies, by holding each other's hands without thinking. Ivy watched them, marveling at the way they just knew. They weren't two girls who had been switched at birth. They were sisters. One evening, months later, Ivy tucked them into bed, smoothing the blankets over their small bodies. Mara hesitated, then looked up at her. "Mom?" Ivy's breath caught. She had never asked Mara to call her that. Never pushed, never expected. She had always assumed it would take time, if it happened at all. Ivy's throat tightened as she nodded. "Yeah, sweetheart." Mara hesitated, then whispered, "Good night." Ivy felt her heart clench. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You were both always mine." Priscilla let out a sleepy sigh, already drifting off. Mara curled deeper under the blanket, her small fingers clinging to Ivy's sleeve for just a moment before letting go. Ivy turned off the light, leaving the door cracked just enough to let the soft glow of the hallway spill in. She didn't cry until she was alone in the living room, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes, willing herself to breathe. Not because she was sad, but because she had never loved anything so much in her entire life. Elena wasn't here. But she was. In Mara's laughter. In the way Priscilla held her sister's hand. In the warmth of a home built from something deeper than biology. Ivy exhaled. Love was what made a family. And theirs would always be whole.